Growing up with a famous sister, Doheen Pratt had every reason to stay on the right path. But in the tough streets of Los Angeles, the choices you make can define your future. So, what led this young man, once surrounded by family and love, into the violent world of gangs? And how did one fateful night change everything? This is the wild story of Doheen Pratt. Doheen Pratt might not be a household name in Hollywood, but he's got ties to the spotlight. Being the brother of actress Kyla Pratt, he's always been close to the world of fame, even if he's not the one in front of the cameras. Born on June 14th, 1990, in the US, Doheen started his journey in Los Angeles, California, the city where dreams are made and stars are born. Growing up in a place where the entertainment industry runs the streets, he was always surrounded by that Hollywood energy. His parents, Johnny McCullough and Keisha Pratt McCullough, kept things grounded though. Johnny was juggling semi-pro basketball while working toward becoming a stockbroker, and Keisha was shaping young minds as a teacher. With a strong foundation at home, Doheen and his siblings grew up with both ambition and support. And speaking of siblings, Doheen has two sisters and a brother, Alan. But they're more than just family. They're a solid unit, the kind of bond that doesn't just happen overnight. It's built over years of shared experiences, inside jokes, and always having each other's backs no matter what. Growing up in Hollywood, Doheen was always surrounded by his siblings, including his famous sister, Kyla Pratt. Now, Kyla Lissa Pratt has been in the Hollywood game since she was just a kid, shining as the star of the Pratt family. She started acting at only 8 years old, landing her first gigs in Nike commercials and an interactive computer game. Not long after, she popped up on Walker, Texas Ranger, proving early on that she had the talent to make it big. To sharpen her skills, she studied at the prestigious Hamilton Academy of Music in Los Angeles, a school known for producing top-tier talent. She wasn't alone either, studying alongside future actors like Candice Lifson, Cherish Lee, Emile Hirsch, and Zoma Crum, setting the stage for a career that would soon take off. And take off it did. Back in the day, you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing Kyla Pratt. She was everywhere, guest starring and landing recurring roles on hit shows like Sister, Family Matters, The Parkers, Smart Guy, Lizzie McGuire, and Moshe. She even made an appearance on Friends. And let's not forget Dr. Dolittle in '98. That movie kicked off a whole franchise, cementing her as a familiar face in Hollywood. Then came the role that made her a household name. In 2001, Kyla became the voice of Penny Proud in The Proud Family, Disney Channel's first ever animated series. That show was a cultural moment, running strong until 2005. But Kyla wasn't just making waves in animation. Also that same year, she stepped into the role of Brianna Barnes on One-on-One, a UPN hit that lasted 6 solid seasons before wrapping up in 2006. Even years later, people still recognize her impact. In 2014, VH1 ranked her number 97 on their list of the 100 biggest child stars. But acting isn't her only talent. Kyla can sing too. She was part of the Disney Channel Circle of Stars covering Circle of Life, and she even sang It's All About Me from The Proud Family. With a career full of unforgettable roles and a dedicated fan base, Kyla Pratt continues to shine. But while Kyla was chasing her dreams, her younger brother, Doheen, was walking a different path. He got involved with gangs at just 12 years old, becoming an active member of the 190 East Coast Crips. Now, the 190 East Coast Crips, also known as the 190 East Coast Block Crips, aren't just another name in the streets. They're a well-established and active African-American gang that's been holding down the east side of Carson, California for decades. They're part of the larger East Coast Crips, a notorious faction with deep roots in LA's gang culture. But before they were the 190 East Coast neighborhood Crips, or even part of the East Coast Crips, they had a different identity. They were the Del Amo Crips. They got their name from their stomping grounds, the south side of Del Amo Boulevard. Back then, Carson's gang scene was bubbling with different crews like the Leadership Crips, the West Side Block Crips, and the East Side Block Players. Eventually, these crews came together, and that's how the Del Amo Block Crips were born. By the early 80s, the Del Amo Block Crips had evolved into the 190 East Coast Crips. It's wild to think about because the area they started in wasn't some rundown slum. It was a middle-class neighborhood. But as the gang took root, things changed. What was once a peaceful part of Carson became one of the city's most dangerous zones. The 190 East Coast Block Crips built a reputation fast, and not just locally. they became one of the most feared and hated gangs in the region. Their turf stretches far, covering a big chunk of Carson. Their territory runs from Del Amo Boulevard to Wilmington Avenue, and from there it pushes all the way to University Avenue. On the surface, it doesn't even look like a gang-heavy area. If you roll through, you'll see big two-story houses, fresh-cut lawns, backyard swimming pools, and nice cars parked in the driveways. At a glance, it looks like any other quiet, middle-class suburb. But looks can be deceiving. This neighborhood is deep in the gang life. Over time, the 190 East Coast block Crips have grown in numbers and reputation. They're known for making noise in Carson and beyond. Even though they're an East Side gang, they've got enemies on both sides of the city. Inside the gang, there are two main groups, the Young Bastard Clique and the Del Amo Block. But the Young Bastards, they're just as ruthless as the Del Amo Block, maybe even worse. They're one of the reasons the 190 crew have so many enemies in the streets. Their reputation is built on savagery, and they don't back down from anyone. When it comes to alliances, the 190 East Coast Crips ride with other East Coast Crips, the neighborhood Crips, the block Crips, and most crews under the Deuce umbrella. But their biggest enemies, the Gangster Crips, better known as the Trays. But it's not just them. The East Coast Crips have a long list of rivals, including the Carson West Side Piru, Stevenson Village Crips, Centerview Piru, Cabbage Patch Piru, and every Piru gang coming out of Compton. Now, Doheen had just gotten in with the crew, and now it was time to prove he belonged. No more just hanging around, he had to show he was really about that life. So, the gang set it up. Javier Johnson was the one chosen to bring him along for his first mission. That night, Javier, Marcus, and Doheen grabbed two guns, hopped in a car, and went hunting. Their target? Anyone from the other side. They drove deep into enemy territory, searching for the right moment. And on November 28, 2003, they found it. Nicole Williamson and Raynesha Bates weren't thinking about gangs that night. They were just kicking back in front of Nicole's house, parked in her car, chilling with Jari Davis, Travion Jackson, and a few others. Music playing, just another night in the neighborhood. Then, out of nowhere, another car rolled up. Before anyone could react, shots rang out. Nicole's father ran to help, desperately trying to bring his daughter back with CPR, but it was too late. Nicole died in his arms. Raynesha, hit in the arms and chest, barely survived. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from her wounds. None of them, Nicole, Raynesha, Davis, or Jackson, were in a gang, but the block they were on, that was claimed by the Piru Centerview gang, and those three guys standing outside were members of the Piru Centerview gang. Later, when the dust settled and the police started piecing things together, Davis and Jackson pointed to a familiar face in photos, Doheen Tiny Killer D. Pratt. They had no doubt he was the one who pulled the trigger. But as for the other two in the car, nobody could say for sure. The car vanished. The gun, never found. The bullets taken from the scene matched a few different types, a .38, a .357 revolver, maybe even a 9mm. But one thing stood out. No shell casings were left behind. Then in May 2005, about a year and a half after the shooting, two detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Mitch Lohman and Mitch Robeson, sat down with a guy named Yonte Christian. Christian was part of the Bounty Hunter Watts gang, and they wanted to know what he knew about that night in November 2003. Christian's statement was recorded and later played for the jury at Johnson's trial. He told the detectives that the day after the shooting, Pratt, the one who pulled the trigger, showed up at his house with Johnson and another guy named Marcus Lloyd. They came in talking about how they had just stolen a car. When Christian pressed them about what they'd done, they admitted they had gone to Centerview for a drive-by. And then came the chilling part. They bragged about it, saying, "We just shot some tennis shoes." A disrespectful way of talking about members of the Centerview gang. Christian gave the detectives some key details, but he didn't make it clear who exactly said what. He said Johnson was behind the wheel, Pratt was the shooter, and this was Pratt's first time doing something like that. According to Christian, Johnson and Lloyd were the ones who handed Pratt the gun, since he was trying to prove himself. He also mentioned that they had two guns that night, a .380 Tech and a .38 caliber, but only one was used. He summed it up in a way that painted the scene vividly. They just pow, 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 drive by, you know? Detective Lohman then sat down with Marcus Lloyd, who was just a kid at the time, 14 or 15 during the interview, which meant he was between the ages of 12 to 14 when the shooting went down. When the detective told him that Christian had already put his name out there, along with Pratt and Johnson, Lloyd saw an opportunity. He offered to record a conversation with Johnson. Trying to get some solid evidence, the police set it up. They put Lloyd and Johnson in a van together, wired up, and let the tape roll. Later, in court, parts of that recording were played for the jury. On it, Lloyd brought up the shooting, asking Johnson if he remembered when he shot that woman. Johnson didn't just remember, he owned it. Then he started bragging, talking about how his gang, the YBCs, ran everything, how nobody could touch them. Lloyd kept pushing, asking how long it took before he got locked up. Johnson said about 3 weeks. The two of them went back and forth, trying to piece together exactly when they ended up in jail. Johnson agreed with Lloyd that it was after the situation with that girl in tennis shoes, sometime around Thanksgiving. In the end, Johnson and Pratt were arrested for Nicole's murder and the attempted murder of Rainisha. But in the courtroom, only Johnson stood trial. At the trial, the prosecution laid everything out. The evidence, the recordings, the witness statements. They even brought in a gang expert who broke it all down. Johnson, Pratt, and Lloyd weren't just random kids caught up in the streets. They were part of the Young Bastards clique, a crew under the 190 East Coast Crips. The expert explained how their gang operated. Stealing cars, robbery, assault, murder, substance dealing, vandalism. Violence wasn't just a byproduct, it was how they kept control. And shooting someone in enemy territory, that was a badge of honor, something that raised a member's status. When the prosecution asked what would push someone to do something like this, the expert made it clear it was about respect. The shooter gained clout in the gang, and at the same time, the gang's reputation got stronger. Taking out a rival sent a message. They weren't scared, and they weren't to be messed with. Johnson tried to fight back by bringing in 3 guys from the 190 East Coast Crips to testify. They didn't do much for him, though. None of them could say where he was when the shooting happened. And instead, they threw out the names of 2 other gang members, Little Smurf and Baby Coast, claiming they were the real shooters. But the prosecution shut that down fast. One of those guys, Ship, was actually locked up when the shooting happened. Johnson argued that the trial wasn't fair because the judge didn't tell the jury they needed more evidence beyond an accomplice's word. But that argument didn't hold up. Pratt and Lloyd never even testified in court. Just their recorded statements were played. Even if the jury had treated their words like accomplice testimony, it wouldn't have changed anything. The real problem for Johnson was his own words. The tape didn't lie. His conversation with Lloyd backed up what Christian had already said. Lloyd was leading most of the conversation, but Johnson's responses left no room for doubt. When Lloyd asked if he remembered shooting that woman, Johnson didn't hesitate. He said yes. Then he started bragging about how his gang was untouchable. That wasn't just small talk, that was him admitting to it. And it wasn't just Christian's statement or the recordings. Eyewitnesses also confirmed what happened. They saw 3 young men. They saw Pratt with the gun. They saw it all go down. Johnson tried to make it sound like the jury struggled to reach a decision, but the timeline told a different story. They started deliberating on September 14th and reached a verdict by the morning of the 18th. But in reality, they weren't at it nonstop. They started late on the 14th, took the weekend off, and wrapped it up Monday morning. When you cut out the breaks, they really only deliberated for about a day. As for Johnson's claim that the trial violated his constitutional rights, there was nothing to back that up. The cases he cited didn't even apply. He threw it out there, but there was no real argument behind it. In the end, the jury found Javier Johnson guilty of first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. They also ruled that a gun was used in the crime, that it caused 1 death and left another person seriously injured, and that the crime was committed to benefit a street gang. Since Johnson was at least 16 at the time, he was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. Doheen Pratt, being a minor, ended up in juvenile detention with a 10-year sentence. If he had been 14 at the time, the district attorney could have tried him as an adult, which might have meant life in prison. But because of the law, no matter the crime, a juvenile offender has to be released by the time they turn 25. But even with that sentence, it still wasn't enough for the Williamson family. For years, the Williamsons kept showing up to parole hearings, doing everything they could to keep Pratt behind bars. They weren't alone either. Even the police stepped in. Captain Harris from the sheriff's department wrote a letter to the parole board, laying it all out, reminding them exactly what Pratt had done and urging them not to let him out. According to Harris, that morning, Pratt and a crew of East Coast Crips were out riding, looking for Centerview Piru Bloods to shoot. Investigators dug into it, talking to witnesses and even members of Pratt's own gang. What they found out was clear. Pratt was new, trying to prove himself, trying to earn his stripes. When they spotted a group on Sherman Street, Pratt didn't hesitate. He started firing into the crowd. That's why the sheriff's department was firm. Letting him out was a bad idea, plain and simple. But none of that mattered in the end. The Williamsons got a letter from the state, and just like that, it was official. Pratt was getting paroled. Now, a hearing was set at Eastlake Juvenile Court in East Los Angeles, where a judge would lay down the terms of his probation. After only 8 years, Doheen Pratt walked free. The reason? Good behavior. The Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Juvenile Parole Board made the call, something they laid out in a letter to the victim's family. Deputy District Attorney Adewale Oduye, the one handling the case, explained that the decision was final. As frustrating as it was, there was no way to change it unless lawmakers rewrote the law itself. Pratt had done what the system asked, completed all his required classes at the youth facility, so the parole board let him go. Oduye made it clear, though, that they'd be watching him. If he slipped up, they'd make sure he paid for it. The Williamsons weren't convinced. Pratt had never apologized, never shown the slightest bit of remorse. They believed his family had moved to Redondo Beach. And to make things worse, he was still repping his gang. Now he was being looked at as an OG, someone younger members respected. The whole thing was unbelievable to them. Mr. Williamson couldn't wrap his head around it. People got longer sentences for drunk driving, yet here was his daughter's killer, walking free. To him, Pratt wasn't just some kid who made a mistake. He was a murderer, a killer. Nicole was only 19 when Pratt took her life on November 29, 2003. Now he was out, and it felt like a slap in the face. The judge gave Pratt a strict set of rules. He had to stay out of North Carson, where the gang operated, and he couldn't be around any known gang members. Meanwhile, Johnson, the getaway driver, was still locked up. For the Williamsons, justice failed. But for Doheen Pratt, life was just beginning. Since getting out of prison, Doheen has been keeping a low profile, staying out of trouble, and steering clear of the spotlight. No drama, no headlines, just living life on his terms. When he turned 30 in 2020, Kyla gave a rare glimpse into his world, posting pictures of them together. They both look great, brown eyes, black hair, dark brown skin, and she showed him love with a heartfelt caption. She called him a real one, her brother, and her soldier, welcoming him to the 30 Club and saying he was on a mission. Doheen has always been a private person. He's on Instagram, but he's not out here chasing clout. Just about 6,000 followers and only 3 posts. And when it comes to his love life, that's a mystery. There's no sign of him dating anyone, no whispers about a relationship. Maybe he's keeping things under wraps, or maybe he's just focused on his own path right now. Either way, the rumor mill has been quiet. These days, Doheen is moving in a completely different direction. He's a mentor, working with a youth development group called Mando, Mentors Against Negative Decisions Outreach. It's him and other men who've been through the same struggles, gangs, the system, prison, coming together to guide the next generation. They know firsthand how easy it is to take the wrong path, and now they're using their experiences to help young people make better choices. Doheen has been putting in the work, figuring out his purpose, and focusing on what really matters. Now he's using his story to reach those who need it most. What are your thoughts on this story? Appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.